They smiled when I came back. They congratulated themselves behind my back. They thought I would stay silent. I still remember the exact moment everything collapsed. Not with a scream or a fight, but with a sentence spoken so casually it felt unreal, like a joke delivered too late to laugh at. I had just stepped out of the taxi, my bag still hanging from my shoulder, my body exhausted from travel and time zones, when I saw them waiting near the porch as if they had rehearsed the moment. My father, whose hair had gone more gray than I remembered, and my older brother standing beside him with a drink in his hand, relaxed, amused, almost entertained. I barely had time to ask why they were outside when my father looked at me and said, with no warmth and no hesitation, that the house was no longer mine. The words didn't land at first. They hovered in the air like dust. I asked what he meant, because surely he couldn't mean what he just said, but my brother laughed, the kind of laugh people use when they feel superior, and explained that the house had been sold weeks ago. Paperwork completed, money already gone. He said it like he was sharing good news. I felt my chest tighten, not from anger yet but from disbelief. This was the house I had bought with years of work, the one place that had stayed constant while everything else in my life changed. I looked from one face to the other, waiting for someone to tell me this was a mistake. But my father only shrugged and said it had been necessary. That family sometimes had to make sacrifices, that I wasn't around anyway. That was the moment I understood this wasn't impulsive or accidental. This was planned. The house wasn't just sold, it was taken. I should have shouted. I should have cried. Instead, I smiled, slowly, deliberately, and that smile confused them. My brother asked what was so funny, and I told him nothing, that I was just thinking about how interesting the situation was. They didn't understand what I meant, and I didn't explain, because sometimes silence is more powerful than confrontation. I stepped onto the porch, feeling the familiar wood beneath my feet, and realized this place already felt different, like something sacred had been violated. My father kept talking, explaining how my brother needed help, how debts had piled up, how there had been no other option. I listened without interrupting, because every excuse told me more than any confession ever could. When people justify betrayal, they reveal exactly who they are. Weeks earlier, while I had been away, there had been signs I ignored. Phone calls that ended too quickly. Messages that felt vague. Conversations where my questions were answered with irritation instead of reassurance. I remembered asking about repairs and being told everything was fine. Remembering a strange voice in the background once. Someone asking if the money had arrived yet. The call disconnecting right after. At the time, I told myself not to overthink it. That distance made everything feel strange. Now, standing there, I understood those moments had been warnings. My brother leaned against the railing and told me I would get over it, that I always bounced back, that I was strong. People love to say that when they want permission to hurt you, strength becomes an excuse for cruelty. I asked when the house had been sold, and my father said 3 weeks earlier, his voice firm, defensive, like he had practiced that answer. I asked why I wasn't told, and he said I was busy, that I wouldn't have understood, that decisions had to be made quickly. Quick decisions, I realized, were always made when someone wanted to avoid being questioned. I walked down the steps and across the yard, letting the cold air steady me. The house looked the same from the outside, but it didn't belong to them, and deep down, they knew it. That knowledge sat between us, heavy and unspoken. I turned back and asked them if they wanted to tell me the whole truth now or later. My brother rolled his eyes, dismissive, but his fingers tightened around the can in his hand. My father avoided my gaze. That told me everything. I asked what kind of debt required selling a fully paid home, and the silence that followed was louder than any argument. I listed possibilities calmly, watching their reactions, noticing the flicker of fear that crossed my brother's face when I mentioned gambling. Fear is always honest. My father snapped at me to stop interrogating him, but I reminded him this wasn't an interrogation, it was accountability. Then the front door opened and a woman stepped out holding a mug, her expression polite and uncertain. She introduced herself as the new owner, and in that moment, reality settled in completely. This wasn't a discussion anymore. This was done, or so they thought. I congratulated her and asked, gently, if they had explained everything to her. She looked confused, and my father told me to stop, his voice strained. I asked her who handled the sale, and when she named the middleman, recognition clicked instantly, the kind of person who thrived on rushed deals and blurred lines. I asked if an attorney had been present. She said no. That single word shifted the entire situation. I explained calmly that paperwork could look official and still be wrong, that authority could be claimed without being valid. My father's face drained of color. My brother stopped smiling. I told her the house involved protections that hadn't been respected, that selling it without proper consent wasn't just unethical, it was serious. The word serious changed everything. She asked if the sale was invalid, and I told her it wasn't what she thought it was, that she needed legal help immediately. My father begged me to stop, to keep this within the family, but I reminded him family didn't stop him when he decided to sacrifice me. I told her to speak only through lawyers from now on, and I watched as fear replaced confusion in her eyes. I picked up my bag and stepped away, ignoring my brother when he shouted that I had nowhere to go. I told him that was what he believed, and beliefs didn't change facts. That night, alone in a cheap room with buzzing lights and thin walls, I didn't sleep. I laid out everything I already knew, every document I had collected quietly long before this confrontation, every signature, every timestamp. I remembered standing far away weeks earlier, reading the first notification that something had changed, the cold certainty settling in my stomach before my mind could catch up. I remembered asking for advice, being told to gather information before reacting, being reminded that patience was power. They thought I was unprepared. They thought distance made me weak. They forgot that the calmest people are often the most dangerous when pushed too far. By the time the sun rose, I wasn't angry anymore. I was focused. They believed they had taken everything from me. What they didn't know was that they had only exposed themselves. And consequences have a way of arriving quietly before they arrive loudly. They thought selling my home was the end of the story. Asterisk, they had no idea it was only the beginning. Asterisk. I didn't scream, I didn't beg, I started preparing. By morning, the shock had settled into something sharper, something colder, the kind of clarity that only comes after a betrayal has fully revealed itself. The room smelled like cheap detergent and stale air, but my mind was clear for the first time since I had stepped onto that porch. I sat on the edge of the bed, phone in my hand, watching missed calls stack up, each one a reminder that regret always comes too late. I didn't answer, not because I was afraid of what they would say, but because I already knew. Apologies that arrive after damage are not apologies, they are attempts to escape consequences. I opened the folder I had carried with me for weeks, the one they never knew existed, and spread the papers across the thin blanket like pieces of a puzzle they had tried and failed to hide. Dates lined up too neatly to be coincidence. Signatures repeated with the same confident slant. Transfers marked urgent, expedited, priority. Every detail told the same story. They hadn't panicked, they had planned. I remembered the first moment suspicion crept in, long before the porch confrontation, when a digital alert flashed across my screen late at night, quiet but unmistakable. It hadn't said sold, not yet, only processed, pending, but it was enough to trigger instinct. Instinct is a voice people learn to ignore until it's the only thing left speaking the truth. I remembered standing alone, far from home, reading that message again and again, feeling the slow, creeping certainty that something was wrong. I had called immediately, once, twice again, only to be met with silence that felt intentional. That silence had pushed me into action. I had started asking questions carefully, quietly, the way you do when you don't want to warn the people you're watching. I had requested records, confirmations, transaction logs, every boring, technical thing people assume no one will ever check. That assumption is what destroys them. Now, sitting there, I realized how much they had underestimated me. They thought distance meant ignorance. They thought trust meant blindness. They thought strength meant tolerance. My phone buzzed again, a message this time, short and defensive, saying we needed to talk, that this had gone too far. Too far, I thought, was selling someone's life out from under them and expecting gratitude for it. I set the phone down and stood, pacing the room slowly, rehearsing nothing, because I didn't need to. Truth doesn't require rehearsal. What I needed was patience. I drove back toward the neighborhood just after sunrise, parking far enough away to watch without being seen. The street looked peaceful, ordinary, the kind of place where people believed nothing bad could happen behind neat lawns and trimmed hedges. That illusion had fooled me once. It wouldn't again. I watched as the woman who believed she owned the house stepped outside. Her shoulders tense, her movements uncertain. She didn't look like someone who had slept well. Guilt pricked at me, sharp but brief, because she was collateral damage in a war she didn't know she had stepped into. When she noticed me, her expression shifted from surprise to relief, like she was waiting for someone to explain reality to her. We spoke quietly, measured, both of us careful not to escalate anything yet. She told me her partner was returning that evening, that they had already contacted an attorney, that nothing felt real anymore. I told her she wasn't wrong to feel that way. When trust collapses, reality fractures with it. We exchanged documents, information, facts stripped of emotion, because facts were what mattered now. When my father appeared at the door, his face already tight with anger and fear, the atmosphere changed instantly. He tried to assert control, to remind everyone whose house this was, whose rules applied. That was when I realized something important. He still believed authority came from volume, from posture, from insisting long enough that others would fold. That strategy only works on people who doubt themselves. I didn't. I corrected him calmly, explaining what authority actually meant, what responsibility he had abused, and I watched as his certainty cracked. My brother joined soon after, irritation masking panic, acting inconvenienced by the mess he had created. He dismissed the situation, minimized it, called it overblown, the same pattern he had followed his entire life. Minimization is the refuge of people who refuse accountability. I told him plainly that this wasn't ending the way he thought it would, that outcomes were already in motion. He laughed it off, but his eyes betrayed him. Fear had finally caught up. A neighbor slowed nearby, curiosity turning into concern, and that was when the illusion of privacy shattered completely. This was no longer a family matter they could contain. It had crossed into something public, something documented, something irreversible. I explained the situation without embellishment, because exaggeration weakens credibility, and credibility was my strongest weapon. The response was immediate. Questions, concern, suggestions to involve authorities. My father objected loudly, demanding we handle it internally, but the woman shook her head, her voice quiet but firm, saying she wouldn't ignore legal advice. That was the moment control shifted. I left shortly after, not because the conversation was over, but because my presence was no longer required to keep it moving forward. Processes were now in place that didn't care about feelings or excuses. At the local office, the mood was professional, serious, stripped of drama. I laid everything out methodically, answering questions, clarifying timelines, signing statements. No one raised their voice. No one accused. The facts spoke for themselves. When officials start using words like unauthorized, misrepresentation, and federal protections, conversations change tone quickly. I felt exhaustion settle into my bones, but also something else, something steadier, relief, not because it was over, but because it was finally out of my hands in the best possible way. Later, the woman called to confirm her attorney's assessment. Everything I had said was accurate. The sale could not stand. Liability was being discussed. Restitution was being calculated. I listened, offered cooperation, and hung up knowing this situation had moved beyond anyone's ability to quietly undo it. That evening, the call I knew would come finally did. My father's voice was smaller, less certain, stripped of authority. He said officials had visited. He said he hadn't realized how serious it was. He said he wanted to talk. I told him we would, but not privately, not emotionally, not without witnesses or structure. Silence followed, heavy and resigned. When we met the next day, the tension was different. No shouting, no posturing, just the weight of consequences settling into the space between us. He tried to explain himself again, fear driving every word. But explanations don't erase actions. My brother barely spoke, his confidence replaced by avoidance. Professionals outlined next steps, restrictions, possibilities neither of them wanted to hear. I watched without satisfaction, without joy, because accountability is not revenge, and revenge had never been my goal. What I felt instead was something quieter and more permanent, closure beginning to form. When the meeting ended, I stayed behind for a moment, standing alone in the yard, touching the door frame lightly, reminding myself that places remember even when people betray. I didn't go inside, not yet. That wasn't the point. The point was reclaiming truth. In the weeks that followed, everything slowed into a series of appointments, calls, filings, waiting. Waiting is the hardest part when emotions are raw. But patience had already carried me this far. Updates arrived piece by piece, each one confirming what I already knew. The transaction was void. The fallout was real. Responsibility could not be deflected. One afternoon, I received a message that simply said, "It's official," and I sat there longer than I expected, letting it sink in. They had thought they were clever. They had thought I would arrive confused, emotional, defeated. They had misjudged me completely. Strength does not always look like resistance. Sometimes it looks like restraint. Sometimes it looks like letting systems do what emotions cannot. I understood then that healing wouldn't come from confrontation or forgiveness, at least not yet. It would come from knowing I didn't abandon myself when it mattered most. And as the dust began to settle, I knew the hardest part wasn't what they had done. It was accepting that the people who were supposed to protect me had been the ones I needed protection from. I thought the betrayal was the hardest part. I didn't know what came next would hurt even more. I got the house back, but I didn't get my family back. That loss cut deeper when the confirmation finally arrived that the house legally belonged to me again. It didn't feel like victory the way people imagine it should. There was no rush of joy, no urge to celebrate, no sense of triumph. Instead, there was a quiet heaviness, the kind that settles in your chest when you realize winning still costs something. I sat alone in my car outside the property, the engine off, keys resting in my palm, staring at the front door like it belonged to a stranger. I had fought for this place, protected it, reclaimed it, yet stepping inside felt harder than losing it ever had. That hesitation told me everything I needed to know about what had really been taken. The house was never just walls and a roof. It was trust. It was safety. It was the belief that the people closest to me wouldn't turn my absence into an opportunity. I finally opened the door and stepped inside slowly, almost cautiously, as if the space itself might reject me. The air smelled different, unfamiliar, layered with someone else's life. Furniture had been moved, pictures replaced, routines rewritten. Even though the sale had been voided, the imprint of strangers lingered, and that made the betrayal feel permanent in a way paperwork could never fix. I walked room to room, not touching anything at first, letting memories surface without inviting them. Every corner reminded me of effort, of nights spent fixing things myself, of plans imagined here, of stability built piece by piece. And now, layered over all of it, was the knowledge that my own blood had handed it away without hesitation. In the days that followed, people told me I should feel relieved, proud, satisfied. They said things like, "At least it worked out. At least you stood up for yourself. At least you're strong." I nodded politely, because explaining grief to someone who has never been betrayed feels pointless. Relief and grief can exist at the same time. Strength doesn't cancel pain. If anything, it sharpens it. My father tried to reach out again, sending messages that sounded rehearsed, careful, apologetic without fully accepting responsibility. He said he wanted to make things right, that he hadn't slept, that guilt was eating at him. I believed him. Guilt has a way of showing up when consequences arrive. But belief didn't mean access. I wasn't ready to reopen a door that had already proven unsafe. My brother remained silent, which said more than any apology ever could. Silence was his way of avoiding reflection, of hoping time would soften what accountability could not. The legal process continued quietly in the background, meetings and updates that felt detached from the emotional damage they represented. Documents reduced everything to facts and violations, timelines and outcomes. But none of that addressed the fracture that had opened inside me. I realized then that justice and healing are not the same thing. Justice corrects behavior. Healing rebuilds the self. One afternoon, while sorting through old belongings, I found a box I hadn't opened in years. Inside were photos, letters, small reminders of a family that once felt real. I sat on the floor and looked at them longer than I should have, searching for a moment where everything went wrong. A decision that could explain how love turned conditional. There wasn't one. That was the hardest part to accept. Betrayal doesn't always come from hatred. Sometimes it comes from favoritism, fear, and the quiet decision that one person is more expendable than another. I thought about all the times I had been told I was capable, independent, resilient, and how those compliments had slowly become justifications. You'll be fine. You can handle it. You don't need help. Those words sound supportive until they are used to excuse neglect. I began to understand that being the strong one often means being the one people feel safest hurting. As weeks passed, the house slowly started to feel like mine again. Not because the past was erased, but because I chose to reclaim it on my own terms. I cleaned, repainted, rearranged, not to restore what was lost, but to mark a new beginning. Every change felt like a quiet declaration that I was still here, still standing, still in control of my life. But at night, when the house went silent, the questions returned. How do you grieve people who are still alive? How do you forgive without forgetting? How do you love someone who has proven they will choose convenience over loyalty? I didn't have answers, only boundaries, and for the first time, I understood that boundaries are not punishments. They are protections. Eventually, my father asked to meet again, not through messages, but through a letter handwritten, careful, vulnerable in a way I hadn't seen before. He wrote about fear, about weakness, about mistakes he could no longer undo. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He asked for a chance to listen. That distinction mattered. I agreed to meet, not because I was ready to reconcile, but because I was ready to speak my truth without interruption. When we sat across from each other, he looked smaller than I remembered. Not physically, but emotionally, like the authority he once held had finally dissolved. He spoke slowly, admitting he had chosen the easier path, the familiar one, the one that didn't require confronting my brother. He admitted he had assumed I would survive because I always had. I told him survival should never be an expectation placed on someone as a substitute for care. I told him that love without respect is not love. It's control disguised as concern. He listened. That was new. It didn't erase the past, but it shifted something. My brother never showed up. He sent a message later saying he wasn't ready to talk. I wasn't surprised. Accountability requires courage, and courage had never been his strength. Accepting that felt like letting go of a version of him that never truly existed. There is a particular grief in realizing you loved someone for who you hoped they would become, not who they were. As time moved forward, I noticed changes in myself I hadn't anticipated. I trusted less automatically. I listened more closely. I questioned narratives that once felt familiar. And yet, I felt lighter, freer, less burdened by the need to be everything for everyone. Betrayal had stripped away illusions, but it had also clarified my values. I learned that protecting your peace sometimes means walking away from people who share your blood. It means choosing honesty over harmony, self-respect over tradition. One evening, standing in the living room, sunlight fading through the windows, I realized I no longer felt anger when I thought about them. I felt distance. And distance, I learned, can be healthy. It creates space to breathe, to heal, to rebuild without interference. I didn't know what the future held for my family, whether reconciliation was possible or even desirable. But I knew what the future held for me. Stability built on truth. Relationships chosen, not endured. A life where strength was no longer a liability. The house stood quietly around me, no longer a symbol of betrayal, but of resilience. It had survived being taken, sold, invaded, and reclaimed, just like I had. And in that reflection, I understood something profound. Losing trust changes you, but it doesn't have to harden you. It can sharpen you, clarify you, teach you the difference between loyalty and obligation. I turned off the lights and went to bed that night feeling something close to peace. Not because everything was fixed, but because I had finally stopped pretending it needed to be. The hardest truth wasn't that my family had failed me. It was that I had spent years earning love that should have been freely given. I thought reclaiming my home would heal everything. I didn't realize the real fight was for my heart. Healing didn't arrive quietly. It arrived through distance. And distance hurt. The weeks after everything settled were stranger than the chaos itself. Because silence leaves room for thoughts you can no longer outrun. Without court dates, urgent calls, or confrontation, my days felt almost empty, and in that emptiness, memories resurfaced with painful clarity. I began noticing how deeply the betrayal had rewired me, not just emotionally, but instinctively. Every unexpected message made my chest tighten. Every delayed response triggered suspicion. I realized that trust, once broken, doesn't simply return when circumstances improve. It has to be rebuilt from the ground up. And sometimes the foundation is too damaged to salvage. I kept myself busy, repainting rooms, fixing small things around the house, choosing new routines, not because the house needed it, but because I did. Physical effort grounded me in the present, reminded me that I still had control over what I built next. Friends checked in, offering comfort, validation, advice. Some suggested forgiveness as if it were a shortcut to peace. Others urged distance as if it were cruelty. I learned quickly that healing advice often reflects the speaker's tolerance for discomfort, not the survivor's needs. Forgiveness felt like a distant concept, one I wasn't ready to define yet. What I knew for certain was that reconciliation without accountability would only reopen wounds. My father respected the space I asked for, which surprised me. For the first time, he didn't push, didn't guilt, didn't frame his patience as sacrifice. That restraint told me he was finally learning something, even if too late. My brother remained absent, and the more time passed, the less I expected him to change. That acceptance hurt more than anger ever had. It meant releasing the hope that he would suddenly become someone else. Hope can be a beautiful thing, but misplaced hope becomes self-betrayal. One afternoon, while sorting mail, I found an envelope addressed in handwriting I didn't recognize. Inside was a short letter from the woman who had been caught in the middle of everything. She wrote about how unsettling it had been to realize how easily trust could be manipulated, how grateful she was for my honesty, how this experience had changed the way she would approach every major decision moving forward. She thanked me for protecting her, even when I didn't owe her anything. Reading her words, I felt something soften inside me. Betrayal doesn't only destroy. Sometimes it redirects. Sometimes it teaches you the power of speaking up, not just for yourself, but for others who don't yet see the danger. That realization reframed the pain into something more bearable. It didn't justify what happened, but it gave it meaning. As the season shifted, so did my perspective. I stopped replaying conversations in my head, stopped imagining alternate outcomes where different choices could have spared me. The past became less of a weapon and more of a lesson. I began noticing how often I had silenced my own discomfort in the name of family harmony, how many red flags I had excused because confronting them felt disloyal. Loyalty, I realized, should never require self-erasure. Real loyalty protects, it doesn't exploit. That understanding marked a turning point. I began setting boundaries more confidently in other areas of my life, saying no without apology, choosing rest without guilt. Each small act felt rebellious in the best way, like reclaiming pieces of myself I hadn't realized I'd surrendered. Eventually, my father asked if we could talk again, not to revisit the past, but to understand the future. I considered it carefully before agreeing. When we met, the conversation was quieter, more honest. He admitted he was attending counseling, trying to understand why he had made the choices he did. I listened without rescuing him from discomfort, because growth requires sitting with the truth. He asked what our relationship would look like now. I told him I didn't know, that trust would have to be earned slowly, if at all. He nodded, accepting uncertainty without protest. That acceptance mattered more than promises ever could. It showed respect. Afterward, I felt emotionally drained but strangely lighter, not because everything was resolved, but because I had finally spoken without minimizing myself. That clarity followed me home, settling into the walls, into the quiet moments when I used to feel alone. I no longer did. I had myself. That realization felt revolutionary. I thought about how many people stay in harmful dynamics because leaving feels lonelier than enduring. I had learned the opposite. Loneliness inside betrayal is far heavier than solitude chosen freely. The house had become a refuge again, not because it was unchanged, but because I had changed. I filled it with things that reflected who I was now, not who I had been trying to be for others. I cooked meals slowly, played music I loved, invited friends who respected my boundaries. Laughter returned in small, genuine bursts. Peace followed quietly. One night, sitting alone with the lights dimmed, I reflected on how close I had come to losing more than property. If I had stayed silent, if I had accepted the story they told me, I would have lost my sense of worth. Standing up for myself had been terrifying, but it had also been liberating. I realized then that strength isn't about endurance. It's about discernment, knowing when to stay, when to fight, and when to walk away. The betrayal had forced me to choose myself, and that choice had reshaped my entire life. I no longer saw what happened as a tragedy alone. It was a fracture that let light in, exposing truths I could no longer ignore. The people who remained in my life after that earned their place, not through obligation, but through integrity. And as I prepared for whatever came next, I felt ready, not because I was healed completely, but because I trusted myself to protect my own heart. That trust was something no one could ever sell, steal, or take away again. I thought distance meant losing my family. I didn't know it was how I found myself. I lost my family's trust, but I gained my own, and that changed everything. The final lesson didn't arrive with noise or drama, but with a quiet certainty that settled into my bones one ordinary morning as sunlight spilled across the living room floor. I stood there holding a cup of coffee, listening to the house breathe around me, and realized I no longer felt like I was waiting for something to happen. For years my life had been shaped by anticipation, waiting for approval, waiting for fairness, waiting for others to finally see me the way I saw them. That waiting was gone. In its place was presence. I was fully here, fully aware, fully responsible for my own peace. The betrayal that once consumed my thoughts had become a reference point rather than a wound, something I could look at without flinching. That didn't mean it no longer mattered. It meant it no longer controlled me. I had learned that healing is not forgetting, and it is not excusing. Healing is integrating pain into your story without letting it define the ending. The house felt different now, not because of fresh paint or rearranged furniture, but because the energy had shifted. I walked through each room with intention, grounding myself in the knowledge that I had chosen truth over comfort, clarity over denial. That choice had cost me deeply, but it had also given me something invaluable, self-respect. I thought about my father often, not with bitterness, but with realism. We spoke occasionally, carefully, navigating a relationship that could never return to what it was. He tried, in his own imperfect way, to show accountability, to listen more than he spoke. I acknowledged the effort without rushing forgiveness. Some bridges can be rebuilt, others remain as boundaries. Both outcomes can coexist without cruelty. My brother stayed distant, and over time, that distance stopped feeling like rejection and started feeling like relief. I no longer felt responsible for saving him from himself. Letting go of that role was one of the most freeing acts of my life. I understood then how often love is confused with obligation, how easily people convince themselves that sacrifice is noble even when it destroys them. I had been sacrificing myself quietly for years, believing it made me loyal, believing it made me good. In truth, it had made me invisible. That invisibility ended the moment I chose to speak up, the moment I refused to accept a version of reality that erased me. As months passed, new routines formed naturally. I invested time in friendships that felt reciprocal, in work that felt meaningful, in solitude that felt restorative rather than empty. I laughed more easily. I slept better. I trusted my instincts without second-guessing them. The constant tension I had lived with for so long slowly dissolved, replaced by a calm I had never known before. I realized that peace isn't something you inherit or are given. It's something you build, brick by brick, through hard choices and honest reflection. Occasionally, Memories surfaced unexpectedly, triggered by familiar places or shared stories. When they did, I allowed myself to feel whatever came up without judgment. Sadness, anger, nostalgia, all of it had a place. None of it defined me anymore. I had learned to hold complexity without collapsing under it. One afternoon, while sorting through old files, I came across the original documents from when I bought the house. My signature steady, hopeful, unaware of what lay ahead. I smiled, not because I wished I could go back, but because I saw how far I had come. That version of me had been brave in her own way. This version was braver still. The journey had taught me that family is not just about blood or history. It's about behavior. It's about who shows up with honesty, who respects boundaries, who chooses integrity even when it's inconvenient. I had built a chosen family around me slowly, intentionally, and that foundation felt stronger than anything I had known before. When people asked me how I managed to get through everything, I didn't give them a dramatic answer. I told them the truth. I stopped abandoning myself. That simple shift had changed everything. I no longer chased understanding from people unwilling to offer it. I no longer explained my boundaries to those committed to crossing them. I learned that silence can be powerful, but so can speaking once clearly and then stepping back. The world didn't end when I did that. In fact, it expanded. Standing in the doorway one evening, watching the sky darken, I felt gratitude, not for the pain, but for the growth it forced. If betrayal hadn't shattered my assumptions, I might have lived a life defined by endurance rather than fulfillment. I might have continued proving my worth to people who benefited from my exhaustion. Instead, I chose something else. I chose to live honestly. That choice didn't make me cold. It made me free. I became gentler with myself, more compassionate toward others without tolerating harm. I understood that forgiveness, if it ever came fully, would be for me, not for them. And it would arrive on my timeline, not theirs. The house stood quietly behind me, no longer a symbol of loss, but of survival. It had been taken, contested, reclaimed, just like my sense of self. And just like me, it carried scars that told a story of resilience rather than weakness. I locked the door that night and felt something settle inside me, a certainty that no one could take what mattered most ever again. My worth was no longer negotiable. My boundaries were no longer flexible. My voice was no longer optional. The betrayal had tried to reduce me to something expendable. Instead, it revealed my strength. And if there is one truth I carry forward, it is this: you do not owe loyalty to people who treat your love as currency. You do not owe silence to those who profit from it. You owe yourself honesty, courage, and the willingness to walk away when staying costs you everything. That understanding became my foundation, stronger than any deed, deeper than any title. I turned off the lights and went to bed knowing that while I had lost something precious, I had gained something irreplaceable myself. If my story taught me anything, it's this: sometimes losing everything is how you finally keep yourself. Asterisk.